1972, a teenage king sat down and told the world it had been counting wrong. Not GDP, not growth, not the annual sum of everything manufactured, sold, traded, and consumed. Not the aggregate output of factories and ports and financial markets. Happiness. His name was Jigme Singye Wangchuck. He was 17 years old, newly crowned over one of the most isolated kingdoms on Earth. Landlocked between India and China, no paved roads reaching most of its valleys, no television, no international phone lines, a national currency barely recognized beyond the border. The declaration he made, gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product, would spend the next 50 years echoing through economics departments, United Nations resolutions, and political philosophy seminars on 6 continents. The UN General Assembly would eventually pass a resolution urging member nations to follow Bhutan's example. The first World Happiness Report would be issued at A. Meeting Bhutan's own Prime Minister helped convene. March 20th would be declared the International Day of Happiness. All of this traces back to a teenager in the Himalayas. What he built around that phrase is real, specific, measurable. The Gross National Happiness Framework runs on 9 domains: psychological well-being, health, education, time use, cultural diversity, good governance, community vitality, ecological resilience, and living standards. It uses 33 indicators and 151 variables. Every government policy in Bhutan, every road, every dam, every rezoning decision must pass through a GNH screening tool before it becomes law. The tool evaluates projected impacts on each domain and flags any policy that would produce net harm. A government ministry cannot approve a project that scores negatively on happiness without explaining why publicly to the GNH Commission. Bhutan is carbon negative. It absorbs more carbon than it produces every year. 72% of its territory is forested. Its constitution mandates that no less than 60% remain forested in perpetuity. The country generates enough clean hydropower to export electricity to India and Bangladesh. And yet, during precisely the same years, Bhutan was becoming the world's symbol of conscious, values-led governance. During the same decade, the GNH framework was winning international admiration. 1/6 of Bhutan's total population was expelled from its borders. Over 100,000 people, stripped of citizenship, forced across the border into refugee camps in eastern Nepal. They have not returned. The negotiations failed. The camps were eventually emptied only because Western countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, agreed to resettle the refugees elsewhere, not in Bhutan. Both of these things are true simultaneously. They have always been true. This is Bhutan. The kingdom occupies a fold in the eastern Himalayas, pressed between India to the south and China to the north, shaped by the drainage of rivers that have been cutting through this terrain for millions of years. 38,000 square kilometers, about the size of Switzerland. A population of fewer than 800,000 people, less than the population of a medium-sized European city, spread across some of the most vertical terrain on Earth. In a single day of driving, you pass from subtropical forest at 300 meters above sea level to alpine meadow at 4,000, to glaciated ridgelines where nothing grows at all except lichen on granite and the occasional prayer flag strung across a pass and snapping in winds cold enough to cut through every layer. The rivers are jade green in their lower reaches, glacial blue higher up. They flow through gorges so narrow and steep that the valley floor receives direct sunlight for only a few hours each day. The dzongs, the great fortress monasteries that administer every district, sit at the high points, on ridgelines or at river confluences commanding the approaches. You can see them from an hour away, white walls above the tree line. Most of Bhutan looks like this because Bhutan decided to keep it looking like this. The 72% forest cover is not a residue of underdevelopment. It is a constitutional flaw. The founding document of Bhutan, ratified in 2008 when the country transitioned to constitutional monarchy, requires that no less than 60% of the country's land remain under forest cover in perpetuity, regardless of what any future government decides. Not policy, not regulation, the Constitution itself. It is, as far as legal scholars have been able to determine, the only constitution on Earth with a biodiversity flaw written into it. The forests are not empty. But the land belongs to more than the people who name it. In the hills above Thimphu, the capital, a city of around 815,000 people, the government maintains a sanctuary for Bhutan's national animal. The takin. There is nothing else on Earth quite like it. The body of a muskox, the face of a gnu, a coat of long, coarse fur that hangs in thick tufts around the shoulders and flanks. An expression of permanent, unimpressed certainty. It moves through the forests slowly, with the quiet confidence of something that has been here long enough to know nothing can surprise it. The takin is the product of a miracle. The legend involves Drukpa Kunle, the divine madman, a 15th century Buddhist master who made a career of breaking conventions, wandering the Himalayas, drinking and transmitting Buddhist teachings through methods that polite society found disturbing. He was one of the most unconventional religious figures in Bhutanese history. He is also one of the most revered. A crowd of pilgrims once demanded he perform a miracle. He agreed. He ate an entire goat, then an entire cow. Then he took the skull of the goat, pressed it onto the spine of the cow, and commanded the assembled bones to walk. The takin was what walked. Science has a more measured account. The takin belongs to the Caprini tribe, related to sheep and mountain goats, its lineage in these mountains extending to the late Pleistocene. It has lived here, largely unchanged, for hundreds of thousands of years. It does not need to change. The terrain that shaped it has not changed. The forests that feed it have not been cleared. In a country that decided not to let modernity erase everything, the takin endures as evidence that the decision worked. Thimphu itself is a capital that removed its traffic lights in 2009 because they felt too impersonal. The city had installed them. Locals said the intersection felt cold. A police officer in a white booth, directing traffic with white-gloved gestures, felt more human. The lights came down. Bhutan makes decisions like this. Thimphu became Bhutan's capital only in 1961, when the third king, established it as the country's administrative center. Before that, Punakha had served that function for 3 centuries. Today, the city sprawls across a high-altitude valley in a way that looks contained and deliberate. Building codes require that every structure incorporate traditional Bhutanese architectural elements. The sloping roof lines, the whitewashed walls, the red ornamental bands, the carved wooden balconies. There are no glass and steel towers. The skyline from any hill looks more like a large, well-ordered town than a 21st century capital. Above the city, overlooking the entire valley from a hill that was once a royal estate, the Buddha Dordanma watches. 51 meters tall, gold and bronze, seated on a white stone throne. Visible from nearly everywhere in the Thimphu Valley, and from above it, and from the highway approaching it. When the afternoon sun catches the statue at a particular angle, gold appears lit from inside rather than from above. 125,000 smaller Buddha statues are enshrined within its walls. The construction fulfilled a centuries-old prophecy recorded in ancient Buddhist texts that a great Buddha would emerge from these mountains to bring peace and happiness to the world. Whether the prophecy is fulfilled depends on what you believe about prophecies. What the statue does, unmistakably, is remind you, from every vantage point in the capital, that in Bhutan, the boundary between the spiritual and the governmental has never existed. That dual architecture, sacred and civic, inseparable, mutually constituting, runs through everything Bhutan built. It has one architect. Zhabdrung Ngawang Namgyel arrived in Bhutan in 1616. He came not entirely by choice. He was 22 years old. A Tibetan Lama of the Drukpa Kagyu school, born at Ralung Monastery in southern Tibet, recognized from birth as the reincarnation of a prominent master. He had been in a succession dispute. A rival claimant, backed by the temporal ruler of Dzong, had contested his religious authority. The Dzong ruler was sending armed men to arrest him. The night before he fled, Zhabdrung had a dream, a large raven flying south. In Bhutanese cosmology, the raven-headed Mahakala is the chief protective deity of the kingdom. He followed the raven south. He arrived in western Bhutan to find a country of warring valley kingdoms, rival lamas controlling separate territories, local lords who had never agreed on anything, no common language of governance, no shared identity. Over the next 30 years, working from a position of initial weakness, Zhabdrung defeated 5 separate Tibetan invasions, subdued rival religious factions, promulgated a legal code, and unified the valleys into a single state. The instrument of his unification was the dzong. Dzongs are not simply fortresses, and they are not simply monasteries. They are both simultaneously. Massive, whitewashed structures of stone and timber built on ridge lines and at river confluences, designed to be impossible to take by force and impossible to overlook from the approaches. Zhabdrung placed them at strategic choke points throughout the valleys. Each served simultaneously as a military garrison, an administrative center, and a center of religious practice. From the dzongs, he administered a system he called Cho-Seed, the balance of religion and state. Spiritual authority rested with the Je Khenpo, the head of the religious establishment. Secular administrative authority with the Druk Desi, neither subordinate to the other, both governing the same population from the same building. This system exists today in modified form, in Bhutan's constitutional monarchy. The Gyakhenpo still heads the religious body. The king and parliament govern the secular state. The two do not compete. They coexist, as Zhabdrung intended, because the premise of his governance was that material welfare and spiritual flourishing cannot be separated, that a government attending only to one has failed in its fundamental duty. That premise is what GNH would give a name to 300 years later. Zhabdrung died in 1651. The political structures he had built were not yet stable enough to survive without him. His ministers made a decision. They told no one he was dead. They issued orders in his name. They explained, when asked, that he was on an extended, silent retreat. For 54 years, the kingdom continued under the authority of a man who was already gone, until the institutions were strong enough to stand without him. The ghost of the founder held the country together. East of Thimphu, the road climbs to Dachula Pass at 3,050 meters. On clear mornings, and many mornings are not clear here, the clouds move fast through the passes. The high Himalayan peaks of the Black Mountains stretch across the northern horizon. Masagang, Sendagang, Terigang. 20 summits above 7,000 meters, white and indifferent, unchanged in 10,000 years. At the pass, 108 white memorial chortens stand in rows. Stupas of graduated sizes, prayer flags strung between them, snapping in a wind that has no intention of stopping. Pilgrims walk between the chortens in the early morning mist, turning brass prayer wheels, lips moving. Her Majesty the Queen Mother, Ashi Dorji Wangmo Wangchuk, commissioned the chortens in 2004 to honor the Bhutanese soldiers who died in a 2003 military operation to clear Indian militants from the forests of southern Bhutan. 108, the number of beads on a Buddhist prayer mala, the number of volumes in certain Buddhist scriptural collections. Sacred in a way that resists simple explanation. From the pass, the road descends into the Punakha Valley. The valley opens slowly as you lose altitude, the temperature rising, the vegetation shifting, pine and fir giving way to subtropical growth, banana palms appearing beside the road, the rivers visible below. Two rivers, the Pho Chu, the male river, the Mo Chu, the female river. They run separately from the high mountains, following different valleys, converging on the valley floor. At their confluence between both rivers stands Punakha dzong. Zhabdrung chose this ground deliberately. The confluence of two rivers carries specific meaning in Bhutanese Buddhist cosmology, a place of balance, of held tension between opposing forces, neither river dominant. He built the dzong in 1637 at the precise point where the balance occurs. Punakha dzong served as Bhutan's capital for 300 years. The kings were crowned here. The most significant treaties of the kingdom were signed within these walls. The Gyakhenpo still leads the monastic body here every winter. The seasonal migration from Thimphu to the warmer valley has been maintained without interruption for nearly 4 centuries. The dzong has survived fires, multiple floods, an earthquake, a Tibetan invasion in which Zhabdrung himself stood at the walls invoking the protective deities of Bhutan. Each time, it was rebuilt. The same stone, the same timber joinery, the same hand-painted murals, executed by artisans trained in methods unchanged across centuries. The Bodhi tree that Zhabdrung planted in the central courtyard in 1637 is still growing. Inside, monks in crimson robes move between prayer halls and government offices through the same corridors. The architecture assigns no separate wing for the religious and administrative functions. They share walls. They share light. This is not coincidence. It is the original intention expressed in stone. In the lower courtyard beside the river, the suspension bridge that connects the dzong to the riverbank sways gently. Below it, the Pho-chu and Mo-chu have just met, and the combined river carries the color of both, blue-green, moving fast, cold, even in June. In 1907, after a period of internal fragmentation and civil conflict following the death of the last Druk Desi, the Penlops, the regional governors, gathered at Punakha dzong and elected Ugyen Wangchuck as the first hereditary king of Bhutan. It was a practical decision. Bhutan needed a single, stable authority. The Wangchuck family, who had controlled the governorship of Trongsa for 2 generations, had the alliances, the resources, and the military record to hold the country together. The British Indian government recognized the monarchy immediately. The 2 countries signed a treaty the following year. Bhutan's foreign relations would be guided by British advice. In exchange, Bhutan received assurances of non-interference in its internal affairs. It was a careful arrangement. Bhutan never became a British colony. It never became an Indian one, even after Indian independence in 1947. The Wangchuck kings maintained a deliberate distance from both giants, close enough to be protected by their proximity, distant enough to remain sovereign. That distance is still the operating principle. Bhutan has no formal diplomatic relations with China. It does not belong to the same political bloc as India. It calibrates its position between 2 of the world's most powerful nations with the patience of a country that has been doing this kind of calibration since the 17th century. The dzong, in this light, is not a relic. It is still the operating metaphor. Balance. 2 rivers, 2 authorities hold the confluence. West of Punakha, the road crosses back over the mountains and then descends toward a valley unlike any other in Bhutan. Phobjikha opens without warning, a wide, flat-bottomed glacial valley ringed by forested ridges, its floor a mosaic of wetland, dwarf bamboo, and pale barley fields harvested back to stubble in late autumn. At 3,000 meters, it is cold here even in summer. In winter, temperatures fall below -4 degrees. The valley stays perpetually damp. Glacial meltwater feeds the wetlands from above. The water table sits close to the surface year-round. Most high-altitude valleys at this elevation across the Himalayas have been converted to agricultural terraces. Phobjikha has not. The reason is a bird. Every year, in late October, black-necked cranes arrive. They come from the Tibetan Plateau, where they have spent the summer breeding along high-altitude lakes at 4,500 meters and above. They cross the Himalayas in flocks, riding thermals down through the passes, descending into the warmer valley. More than 600 of them winter here. This is the largest single concentration of black-necked cranes in Bhutan, out of a world population of fewer than 11,000. The first cranes of the season circle Gangteng Monastery 3 times before landing. This has been observed for as long as anyone can remember. The monastery sits on a low hill at the eastern end of the valley. When the cranes arrive, tired cross-country from Tibet, they perform what appears to be the Buddhist kora, the ritual circumambulation of a sacred site before descending. 3 clockwise circuits. Then they land. Bhutanese tradition holds that the cranes carry the spirits of deceased ancestors back to visit the valley each winter. They are not simply birds, they are emissaries, messengers from another place. Farmers in Phobjikha plant their winter wheat only after the cranes have arrived, as if the birds' presence consecrates the planting season. Their image is painted on houses and shop fronts throughout the country. Their dzong name, Thrung Thrung Ke Nap, means thin, tall, and black-necked. The Bhutanese have been singing folk songs at their arrival since before any scientific record of the species existed. The black-necked crane was the last of the world's 16 crane species to be formally identified by science. Nikolai Przhevalsky of the Imperial Russian Army recorded it on the Tibetan Plateau in 1876. The Bhutanese had known it long before that. The cranes mate for life. They live 30 or 40 years. The same pair returns to the same roost for decades. Some of the cranes circling Gangteng Monastery in late October have been performing that circuit since the 1980s.
In 2008,
The government planned to run electrical power lines through the Phobjikha Valley to connect the villages to the national grid. The Royal Society for the Protection of Nature flagged a concern. Overhead lines would cross the cranes' flight paths. The government buried the cables underground. The cost was considerably higher. The decision was made without extended debate. The valley has no overhead power lines. The cranes fly where they have always flown. In spring, when the time comes to return to Tibet, the last cranes circle Gangteng Monastery 3 times again before departing. Then they are gone, back over the passes, back to the plateau, until October. Gangteng Monastery was founded in 1613 by Gyaltse Pema Thinley, 3 years before Zhabdrung arrived in Bhutan. It is the largest Nyingmapa monastery in western Bhutan, representing a different school of Buddhism than the Drukpa Kagyu tradition Zhabdrung would establish as the state religion. The two schools coexist here as they have throughout Bhutanese religious history, sharing valleys, sharing pilgrims, the theological distinctions managed with a pragmatism that characterizes Bhutanese Buddhism. Every year on November 11th, the birthday of the 4th king, the Black-Necked Crane Festival takes place in the monastery courtyard. School children perform crane dances in feathered costumes. Monks perform masked cham dances. Conservation-themed performances run alongside the religious program. The message in both is the same. The crane's presence is not guaranteed. The wetlands require protection. The balance between agriculture, development, and wildlife is actively maintained, not passively inherited. The cranes, somewhere in the valley below, are indifferent to the proceedings. And our journey continues east, deeper into the mountains. Beyond the Black Mountains, the central divide that separates western from eastern Bhutan, where Bengal tigers move through the lower subtropical forests and the passes exceed 4,000 meters. The road descends into Bumthang. Bumthang is not one valley. It is 4, Choskor, Tang, Yura, and Chume, arranged at high altitude around a central massif. The valley is open and relatively flat, the surrounding ridges heavily forested. At around 2,800 meters, the air carries the scent of pine and juniper smoke from the farmhouses below, cold, clean, still. This is the spiritual heartland of Bhutan, the oldest inhabited landscape in the country, the place where Buddhism first arrived before it spread outward. Guru Rinpoche came here first, before the tiger's nest, before the cave above Paro, before the legend that would define the entire spiritual geography of the country. The teacher who brought Buddhism to Bhutan arrived in the Bumthang valleys in the 8th century. He came, the tradition says, because a king needed healing. Sindhu Raja, the king of Bumthang, was afflicted with an illness that no physician could address. Guru Rinpoche arrived, performed the rituals, drove out the spirits that conventional medicine had no remedy for. The king recovered. He converted to Buddhism. His valleys converted with him. From Bumthang, Buddhism spread into every valley Bhutan contains. The spiritual architecture of the entire country has its root in that moment of healing. The 4 valleys still hold more sacred sites per square kilometer than anywhere else in Bhutan. The dzong, the castle of the white bird, named for the white bird seen flying over the site during its founding ceremony in 1549, stands above the Choskor Valley. Below it, the Kurje Lakang temple complex contains the body print of Guru Rinpoche, pressed into stone during his meditation here in the 8th century. Pilgrims still press their hands to the impression in the rock. The stone has been worn smooth by that gesture across 1,200 years. In the Tang Valley, at the Mebat Cho, the burning lake, something remarkable happened in November 1475. A treasure revealer named Pema Lingpa arrived at the lake with a burning butter lamp. He stood before a crowd of witnesses gathered on the bank. He declared that if he was genuine, he would return from the water with sacred objects the texts said were hidden there. He dove in. He emerged holding a casket of sacred texts and relics. The butter lamp was still burning. The water had not extinguished the flame. The lake is still there. The accounts of what happened in 1475 have been copied and recopied across centuries in monastery libraries. The question of how the flame remained lit through immersion in glacial water has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Back in Paro, the broad green valley that holds Bhutan's only international airport, there is a temple that predates every dzong in the country by nearly 1,000 years. Ki Chu Lakang was built in 659 CE. The builder was Songtsen Gampo, the Tibetan emperor who unified Tibet and spread Buddhism across the Himalayan plateau. He ordered the construction of 108 temples in a single day, a network of sacred sites built to pin a giant demoness to the earth and neutralize her resistance to Buddhism's spread. The demoness lay across the entire Himalayan region. Each of the 108 temples was built at a precise point on her body. Ki Chu Lakang pinned her left foot. The left foot. In Paro. That specificity is characteristic of how sacred geography operates in Bhutan. It is not symbolic or approximate. The demoness had a left foot, and it was here, and the temple was built here, and the monks have been praying here without significant interruption since 659 CE. The original 7th century structure is still standing. Inside, the main statue, Lhotshampa, a depiction of the future Buddha, dates from the original construction. It is one of the oldest surviving Buddhist statues in Bhutan. The face is serene, slightly worn. Butter lamps burn before it in the dim interior. A second temple was added in the 20th century by the Queen Mother Ashi Kesang Choden Wangchuk, built in traditional style, indistinguishable in form from the original. That was the intention. Continuity made visible. 13 centuries with no gap you can see in the wall. There is in Bhutan's history a recurring pattern. The country was built by people who arrived from elsewhere. Guru Rinpoche from India, Zhabdrung Ngawang Namgyel from Tibet. The craftsmen who built the dzongs, many of them from Nepal, invited by the Zhabdrung because Bhutan needed hands and skills it did not yet have. For centuries, Bhutan absorbed people from the south and east and west. They came because the country offered what they needed: fertile land in the lowlands, security, relative order under the dzong system. The farmers of the southern lowlands arrived in the 19th and early 20th centuries, drawn by the same combination. They called themselves the Lhotshampa. They built much of what Bhutan stood on, and Bhutan expelled them. The word Lhotshampa means, in Dzongkha, southern borderlanders. They were Bhutanese citizens of Nepali descent, predominantly Hindu, their families having migrated to the subtropical lowlands of southern Bhutan across the 19th and early 20th centuries. They farmed the plains, they built roads, they staffed the civil service. By the 1980s, they comprised perhaps a third of Bhutan's total population. The most commonly cited figure is between 35 and 40%. One of them was named Teknath Rizal. He had been conscripted at 16 years old under a system called the Wula, compulsory free labor, by which Bhutan required citizens to provide unpaid work to the state. The burden fell disproportionately on the south. He worked, he was educated, he rose through the civil service. By the 1980s, Teknath Rizal was a royal advisor and an elected member of Bhutan's National Assembly. By any reasonable measure, he was precisely the kind of citizen a country building itself around happiness ought to have celebrated. In 1985, Bhutan passed a new Citizenship Act. The act required that to establish citizenship, residents needed documentation proving their families had been present in Bhutan before 1958. For the Lhotshampa, many of whose families had lived in Bhutan for generations, but held no formal pre-1958 land titles, because formal documentation in the southern lowlands had barely existed before the 1960s. The requirement was designed to produce a specific outcome. In 1988, Bhutan conducted a citizenship census using the new criteria. Tens of thousands of Lhotshampa who had lived their entire lives in Bhutan were reclassified overnight as illegal immigrants. The legal ground had been cut from beneath them, quietly, 3 years before the census took place. The same year, the Nepali language was removed from Bhutan's school curriculum. Dzongkha, the language of the Drukpa majority in the highlands, became the sole medium of instruction. For Lhotshampa children who had grown up speaking Nepali, the transition was abrupt. The same year, the national dress code, the Driglam Namjag, was made mandatory for all citizens during business hours. For the Ngalong majority, this was their traditional dress. For the Lhotshampa, it was the clothing of a different culture, imposed by force of law. Teknath Rizal presented a petition to the fourth king. He was asking for reconsideration. He was asking the government to look at what its policies were doing to the communities in the south that had built much of the country's physical infrastructure. He was asking, through the proper institutional channels, as an elected representative, for the state to examine whether its actions were consistent with its stated values. November 1988. He was arrested. He was tortured in custody. He was tried summarily, without adequate legal representation, on charges of spreading rumors and acting against the Tsar Yig, Bhutan's code of conduct and governance. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a military prison. Protests erupted across southern Bhutan in 1990. They were met with military and police action. People fled across the border into Nepal, into India, and, as they crossed, they carried with them the evidence of the problem. They had no documents proving they belonged to Bhutan. The 1985 Citizenship Act had ensured that. By 1993, over 100,000 people had been expelled or had fled, 1 in every 6 Bhutanese citizens. They gathered in 7 refugee camps in eastern Nepal, in the Lhotshampa and Morang districts. The camps became one of the largest concentrated refugee populations in Asia relative to the size of the country that produced them. In those years, the world was looking elsewhere. The Soviet Union was fragmenting. The Balkans were burning. Rwanda's genocide was approaching. A small Himalayan kingdom, expelling its ethnic minority with careful administrative preparation, attracted relatively little international attention. The Refugee Council of Australia would later describe it as extraordinary that a nation could carry out such an expulsion and keep its international reputation largely intact. Thich Rizal was held for a decade. He was released in 1999 in diminished health through sustained pressure by Amnesty International. He did not return to a country that had reconsidered its position. No Lhotshampa refugee has been allowed to return. No negotiation has produced an agreement for their repatriation. The camps in Nepal were eventually emptied between 2007 and 2015, not through return to Bhutan, but through resettlement in the United States, Canada, Australia, and European countries. The villages in southern Bhutan where the Lhotshampa lived were cleared. Some were absorbed into other uses. Some remain empty. Gross national happiness continued, in the same years, to earn its international reputation. The framework that measured happiness did not prevent the largest forced expulsion in modern Bhutanese history. It is possible to design a happiness measurement system that does not include the happiness of everyone. The GNH index measures what the government decides to measure, applied to whom the government decides to include. That decision, made in the 1980s, had consequences that 120,000 people are still living with. What GNH measures? It measures in depth. The 9 domains are operationalized into 33 specific conditions, further broken down into 151 variables, assessed through a national survey conducted every 3 to 5 years. The GNH index uses the Alkire-Foster method, a multidimensional measurement tool developed at Oxford, originally designed to quantify poverty, to calculate what percentage of the population has achieved sufficiency in each condition. A person is considered deeply happy when they have achieved sufficiency in all 9 domains, extensively happy when they have sufficient in 6 or more. The GNH index improves when a person crosses from insufficiency to sufficiency in any domain. It does not improve by making the already comfortable even more comfortable. The framework is fundamentally focused on those with the most to gain from improvement. The GNH screening tool applies this logic to policy. Before any government ministry can proceed with any new project, it must complete a GNH assessment, a structured analysis of how the proposed action would affect each of the 9 domains, for which populations, over what time frame. Policies that score negatively require explicit justification to the GNH Commission before they can proceed. The results of this framework are visible throughout Bhutan in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Bhutan banned tobacco sales in 2005, among the first countries in the world to do so, because the health screening showed clear harm. Healthcare is provided free by the state. Education, through university level, is publicly funded. The government has spent decades building roads into remote mountain valleys, not because roads generate GDP, but because isolation reduces access to health services and community vitality, both negative scores on GNH indicators. The Constitution's 60% forest floor exists because the ecological resilience domain requires it. The underground power cables in the Phobjikha Valley exist because a migratory bird's ability to winter safely in Bhutan is considered part of the country's ecological resilience score. The framework is real. Its effects are real. The distance between the framework's stated values and its application to the Lhotshampa is not a logical contradiction in the philosophy itself. It is a political decision about who counts. And yet humans are not the only ones who carry the weight of what a country decides. Above the tree line, in the highest terrain of Bhutan's northern border, where the ridges exceed 5,000 meters and the glaciers are retreating in an era that has no patience for patience, another resident moves in near total silence. The snow leopard. Fewer than 100 are estimated to remain in Bhutan, perhaps fewer than 80. No one knows the precise number. The animal does not cooperate with census takers. It hunts by night, moving across terrain that would be technically impassable for most mammals, traversing 40-degree scree slopes, descending cliff faces that appear sheer from any approach. It hunts blue sheep and marmots, and when prey is scarce, livestock from villages at the high edge of habitation. It does this without being seen. Local communities in northern Bhutan have reported the snow leopard for generations. Most outside observers, scientists, journalists, wildlife photographers have spent weeks or months in these mountains without a confirmed visual sighting. The animal leaves tracks in the snow, spray-marked boulders, the cached remains of prey under rock overhangs, evidence of presence. The presence itself remains invisible. The snow leopard has been in these mountains longer than Buddhism, longer than the dzongs, longer than the kingdom itself. It predates every human claim on this landscape by tens of thousands of years. Bhutan's network of biological corridors, the protected pathways connecting national parks to each other, allowing wildlife to move across the country without crossing unprotected land, was designed in part for the snow leopard. The animal needs range. It needs elevation gradients to follow across seasons. It needs the ungulate populations that survive only when their habitat is intact, from the valley floor to the high ridgeline. The snow leopard survives in Bhutan because Bhutan chose to let it survive. The choice was made in policy documents. It was upheld in a constitutional mandate. The animal does not know this. It moves at night across its ancient terrain, watched by no one. The camera traps that wildlife researchers have placed along the ridge corridors occasionally capture a blurred image, a pale coat, a long tail, the suggestion of a shape moving past in darkness. Researchers treat these images as significant, a confirmed record. The snow leopard was here. In Bhutan's GNH framework, the ecological resilience domain requires that wildlife populations be tracked and maintained. The snow leopard appears in the national monitoring system as a species of conservation concern. Its survival is, technically, a governance outcome. The same government that expelled the Lhotshampa has spent decades maintaining the habitat of an animal that most of its citizens have never seen. That juxtaposition is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. In spring, across Bhutan, a different kind of watching takes place. The Tsechu festivals, held in dzong courtyards throughout the country, timed to the Bhutanese lunar calendar, are among the oldest living religious festival traditions in the Himalayas. They honor Guru Rinpoche. His 8 manifestations are depicted in the masked cham dances performed by monks over several days of ritual and celebration. The Thimphu Tsechu, held annually in September or October, is the largest. The dzong courtyard fills with thousands of people, monks, farmers, government officials, school children, foreign visitors, gathered to watch the same performances staged here for centuries. The costumes are extraordinary. Carved wooden masks depicting the protective deities of the Dharma, worn by monks who have spent years learning the choreography. The dances are not entertainment. They are instruction. Teachings about karma, about liberation, about the relationship between the human world and what lies beyond it. The cham dancers move in prescribed patterns that have not changed significantly in 300 years. Each step carries doctrinal meaning. The black hat dancers represent the tantric practitioners who suppress demonic forces. The stag-headed and ox-headed deities enact the weighing of the soul at death. The skeleton dancers, in white, moving between the other figures, represent the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The whole performance is, simultaneously, a spectacle for the crowd and a ritual to purify the ground on which it takes place. On the final morning, before dawn, an enormous thangka is unrolled from the dzong wall. Tens of meters of painted silk depicting Guru Rinpoche in his 8 manifestations hung from the white walls while the valley is still in shadow. Pilgrims queue in the dark to receive its blessing. The sun rises. The thangka is rolled back up. Next year, it happens again. Above the Paro Valley, above the airport, above the farmhouses and the barley fields and the prayer flags strung between pines along the river, a cliff rises from the forest. At its face, 900 meters above the valley floor, something white appears between the trees when the light is right. It is not a natural formation. Paro Taktsang, the tiger's nest, a complex of 4 temples, residential quarters, and meditation caves clinging to a sheer cliff face, accessible only by a trail that gains elevation for several hours and ends at a chain of stone steps cut into the rock. There is nothing structural between the monastery and the valley below but the cliff face itself, and the decision, made in 1692, to build here rather than anywhere easier. The story of how it came to be here begins in the 8th century. Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, the Indian Buddhist master who brought Vajrayana Buddhism to Bhutan, arrived at this cliff from Singye Dzong in eastern Bhutan, carried, the legend says, on the back of a tigress. The tigress was a manifestation of his consort, Yeshe Tsogyal, who transformed herself to carry him. He landed at the cliff in his wrathful form, Dorje Drolo, the 8th and most powerful of his 8 manifestations, and entered a cave in the rock face. He meditated there for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours. During that time, he subdued the malicious spirits that inhabited the cliff and the surrounding valley. He concealed sacred texts in the rock face for future treasure revealers to find in later generations. He emerged from the cave in all 8 of his manifestations. The cliff became holy ground. No temple was built then. The cave was enough. Pilgrims came to meditate at the site for centuries. Milarepa, the 11th century poet-saint, came here. The Tibetan yogini Machig Labdron came here. Phajo Drugom Jigpo came here in the 13th century and received a vision in meditation that designated Taksang as one of the 12 sacred sites entrusted to him by Guru Rinpoche himself. For 900 years, the cave was the sacred site, and the cliff its altar. The first sanctuary near the cave was built in the 14th century. Small, modest, sufficient. Pilgrims came. The path up the cliff was worn by the passage of 10,000 feet. In 1692, the 4th Druk Desi, Gyaltse Tenzin Rabgye, visited during the Tsechu season and made a decision that changed the scale of everything. He would build a monastery around the cave. He laid the foundation for the Guru Lakang, the temple of the Guru with 8 names, directly over and around the place where Guru Rinpoche had meditated 900 years before. The construction was completed and the complex consecrated the same year. During the work, witnesses in the Paro Valley below reported seeing the Tenzin Rabgye simultaneously inside and outside his meditation cave, a sign, in Bhutanese tradition, that the man building the monastery was himself a manifestation of the Guru. The monastery complex grew over the following decades. More temples, residential quarters for the monks who would live here year-round. Meditation chambers cut deeper into the cliff face. The whole structure anchored to the rock with a combination of timber joinery and belief that, for 300 years, held. Then, in April 1998, fire. The cause was never definitively established. A butter lamp, most accounts suggest, left unattended in one of the inner sanctums. The fire gutted the main temple complex. Priceless Thangka paintings, ancient murals that had covered the interior walls for 3 centuries. The structural timberwork that held the buildings against the cliff face. What burned could not be recreated. The paintings were irreplaceable. The murals were irreplaceable. The fire did not care about their age. The Bhutanese made a decision that was entirely characteristic of how this country responds to loss. They rebuilt. The reconstruction took 7 years. Artisans trained in traditional Bhutanese carpentry and masonry worked on the cliff face. New murals were painted, not as museum reproductions, but as living religious art, executed by painters trained in the same iconographic tradition, following the same design principles, applying the same mineral pigments to the same surfaces. The paintings are not the same paintings, but they carry the same tradition expressed in the same forms, for the same purpose. The monastery reopened in 2005. Photography inside Paro Taksang is prohibited. Cameras are surrendered at the entrance. This is not a crowd management regulation. It is a statement about what the space is for. The interior is not a spectacle. It is a practice space. Butter lamps burning in the dim chambers, the low hum of monks at prayer in the inner rooms, the smell of juniper incense through the rock passages, the sound of wind against the outer walls, 900 meters above the valley. The experience of the tiger's nest does not occur at the surface where photographs are made. It occurs in the 3-hour climb, in the burning of legs on the final switchbacks, in the crossing of the chain-link bridge over the waterfall gorge, in the moment of entering a cave where something is present that predates every human record of this mountain. The Bhutanese believe that crossing the threshold brings a blessing. Not from the building. The building is, in significant part, new, from what the building was built to contain. This is the structure of Bhutan, a country that built its entire governance philosophy around something that cannot be measured in currency, then built the measurement system anyway, then rebuilt the monastery after fire, extended the measurement to include the cranes and the forest and the snow leopard and the well-being of people not yet born, and failed in the 1980s and 1990s to extend it to 100,000 of its own citizens who needed it most. Both things persist, the monastery and the empty villages, the happiness index and the refugees who are not in it, the golden rooftops above the cliff and the camps that were emptied not by return but by departure to other countries. The cliff holds both. In the narrow forest strip along Bhutan's southern border with India, where the subtropical lowlands of the Brahmaputra Valley meet the first foothills of the Himalayas, lives one of the rarest primates on Earth, the golden langur, formally identified by science in 1953 when the naturalist EPG described it to the scientific community and assigned it to a new species. The Bhutanese had known it long before 1953. They knew where it lived, they knew its habits. They had names for it in multiple valley dialects. Long, silky fur, the color of amber and gold, darkening to deep rust on the back in winter. A jet-black face framed by a halo of pale hair. Pale, remarkable eyes that hold something difficult to name. It moves through the forest canopy in groups, foraging on leaves, flowers, and fruit, rarely descending to the ground. It is not easy to see. It is not trying to be seen. Its entire range is a thin strip of forest, not a forest system, a strip. The Manas River on the east, the Sankosh River on the west, the Bhutanese foothills on the north, the Brahmaputra Plains on the south. A corridor of subtropical and lower montane forest shared between Bhutan and India, perhaps 200 kilometers long and rarely more than 100 kilometers wide. That strip is all that remains of a range that was once larger. On the Bhutanese side, the forest has held the 60% constitutional mandate, the biological corridor network, the legal protection of wildlife habitat going back decades before most of the world had common language for biodiversity conservation. On the Indian side, agricultural expansion and settlement have continued to reduce the strip over decades. The golden langur lives on a line drawn by two different countries' decisions, and the line is not stable. There is something particular about this animal, about watching it move through the canopy at the forest edge, its amber fur catching light where the trees thin, then vanishing again into shadow, that brings the entire paradox of Bhutan into focus. This is a country that protected the forest, that wrote the protection into its constitution, that built the corridors and buried the power cables and did the accounting that most countries never bother to do. A small number of people in a small country made a set of decisions that kept something rare alive. And in the same country, in the same era, under the same administrative structure, another set of decisions were made about a different population. Decisions that were also constitutional, also deliberate, also sustained over decades. The golden langur does not weigh these things against each other. It has no access to the accounting. It moves through what remains of its forest on the Bhutanese side of the line because the forest remains. That is what persistence means in this place, on this day. Not triumph, not resolution. still present. What do you make of a country like this? A country that embedded happiness in its constitution, screened every policy against it, buried electrical cables to protect a bird, rebuilt a monastery that had stood for 3 centuries because the alternative was to lose something that cannot be replaced. And a country that in the 1980s and 1990s stripped citizenship from a third of its population, expelled them, and has never let them return. These are not two sides of the same coin. They are not in balance. The forest mandate does not counterweigh the expulsion of the Lhotshampa. 100,000 people's lives cannot be measured against ecological resilience indicators. What they are is simultaneous. They happened in the same place, at the same time, under the same governance philosophy, by the same government. Any account of Bhutan that holds only one of these facts is an incomplete account. What the country demonstrates is the gap between what a governance philosophy can accomplish and what it can permit. The G&H framework produced real gains in health, in environmental protection, in the well-being of a small mountain population navigating modernity on its own terms. The same framework, applied by the same government, did not prevent, and may have rationalized, one of the largest forced expulsions in modern Asian history. The monastery on the cliff is still there. The villages in the south are still empty. The kingdom that chose to measure happiness instead of money is still asking what happiness means, and for whom. That question has not been answered. It may not be answerable, but it is perhaps the most important question any country can ask. If what you found here stays with you, if the cranes and the dzongs and the questions that come with them are worth returning to, we have more of this waiting. Each week, a new country, a new story that refuses to be simple. Subscribe to Where on Earth and continue the journey. We will see you on the next road.